Okay, just continuing the series of shooting from the hip. I just had an idea that I'd like to try to express, and I'm going to begin by reminding people, those of you who are just running across this channel for the first time, that everything I'm talking about is built on this theory that the trigram is a representation of a mind in time, where each of the 8 trigrams is a configuration within time. So if you haven't gotten up to speed on that, I suggest you check out the link that I will now try to put in the upper, I think, right-hand corner. It outlines the basics of the theory. And with that, I want to talk about an argument for trusting in the way things are. You could say trusting in God, having faith, or you could say trusting in the universe, if that makes you uncomfortable. Either of those ways of formulating, of course, there's a million different ways of formulating the same thing, depending upon what kind of symbology you're working with. And here we're just talking about mind states, but I'm going to use a bunch of words in order to refer to it, and I'm using the words that are comfortable for me because of my particular background and the language that I grew up in. But in theory, all of these ideas could just simply be expressed within this system. And then you'd just be saying something like, well, wind, but actually lake. Let's see. So how do we say this? Let's say that, what's an appropriate thing to put on the screen for this? Maybe this one. I think it's fair to assume that there's always some form of consciousness that understands things better. That is to say, let's just talk about human beings for a moment. Those of us who are interested in this type of stuff are at one level of intelligence and perception. But it's perfectly reasonable to say that, maybe we're somewhere in the middle. And there are far more perceptive and intelligent human beings, let's say, in the hierarchy, if you like. And let's save the discussion of whether or not there are other species or other forms of consciousness that are more intelligent than human beings in the aggregate. It seems reasonable to surmise that might be the case, although we may not have any direct evidence of it. But there's an overall sense that something is wrong. You might say that the idea that we have, let's just look at the postnatal for a second here. The idea that we have about how things are supposed to be is empty of substance. So we're continually being disappointed in the visions that we have of how things might be, because it just doesn't work out the way that we wanted them to. But isn't that just an indication that we have the wrong idea of how things are supposed to be? This is how we want things to be, but this is how they are. We want things to be because we're built on sensation. We're incorporated, you could say. The Taoists have this wonderful phrase, I don't remember what text it is, but it says, suffering comes from having a body, in essence. All of the various disadvantageous things, we might call it evil, we might call it pain, disease, all of these things come from having a body, sensation. We are experiencing now. The past and the future are artifacts of mind. They're things that we turn around in our head. But the thing that's happening is the thing that's happening now. What we're doing is we're experiencing the present. Now, when it really comes down to it, we don't know whether or not what we're experiencing is ultimately going to turn out well or poorly. It may seem like things are going to turn out poorly, but we could be wrong about that. It may seem like things are going to turn out well. It may not seem like that right now, but there are points in life where it seems like things are just going great, right? Every now and then, people are lucky enough to have that feeling. But that doesn't mean that's how it turns out. So all of that is just to say that we quite often just get it wrong because we're not that intelligent. We're not that perceptive. We're very limited beings. But there are probably some amongst us who are far more intelligent and far more perceptive. And okay, so let's say that it's possible that there are other beings who are even more intelligent and perceptive. You know, some people have made the argument that everything that we're doing is actually to serve the plants. You know, the production of carbon dioxide is going to be wonderful for them. So somehow or another, they've convinced us that we should overpopulate and industrialize and just create all this effluence that they're going to get to suck up, and it's going to be their time. And it kind of always is their time. You could say they preceded all of us animal life, and so they have a deeper wisdom. And you can make the argument that, you know, prior to them, you had this period of essentially bacteria, single-celled organisms, and that they are the oldest wisdom. Which is why, you know, you could make a decent argument that it's all about DNA, because, you know, DNA is determining the behavior of each and every cell, each and every single cell, each and every bacterium, you could say. Because basically we are colonies of bacteria, right? The pervading sense that there's something wrong, you know, how do we characterize that here? It's sort of the transition between here and here. Because we had this idea about how it was supposed to be, and it didn't turn out that way. So something must be wrong. Well, yeah, something is wrong. What's wrong? Our idea of how things are supposed to be. So another way of phrasing this is that a sage, a hypothetical sage, would be someone who understands how things really are. And that would be the person who would most likely rise to the top of any given hierarchy because they have a better understanding than everyone else. And so they would see how things are supposed to go, not according to their will, just how things are going. They live in accordance with reality, which is far greater than any of us. And so the sage cannot impose their will, right? So anyone who's operating at that level is, in essence, aware of the actuality of things. And those of us who are, in essence, ignorant of that actuality, and I include myself in that group, because I don't really know what's going on. I have some ideas about it, but who knows? You know, as far as I'm concerned, the closest I can come to the truth is that I just don't know. I don't really understand. And so my position is that fundamentally we are subject to the forces of history. And that we don't really know how it all turns out. But if someone were more perceptive than I and more intelligent, or if there were some other being more perceptive than I and more intelligent, you know, maybe they also are blind to certain things, but they would have more of a opportunity to act in accordance with how things are. And so to that extent, it would make sense to simply place faith in the intelligences that are greater than us. We don't know who they are. It's pretty clear that they're not the people who we typically entrust. I mean, it seems that at the lowest end of the scale are the so-called leaders that we presently have. You know, now maybe they do have information that we don't have, but certainly whatever it is that they claim they're doing is not what they do. They make a whole bunch of promises and they don't fulfill them, and they're often just outrageously hypocritical and just a terrible distraction of time and energy. I think of politics as being one of the most dismal things because it's all based on this idea of what we want, particularly in a democracy. That's why democracy, it comes from the root in Greek, daemon, which is the nature spirit, sometimes translated as demon. Because when we just run after what we want, it's never really, doesn't work out well for us. But maybe that nature spirit is sort of what's necessary in order for the churning of existence to continue. And even though it leads to some very unfavorable circumstances, it's just part of the inexorable cycle of change that happens within this material realm. But from this point of view here, it's just the way things are. There's nothing we can really fundamentally do about it. And you can think of that as being a thermodynamic reality. When you stand back from all of the personal tragedy that happens, fundamentally, energy is being converted from a usable to an unusable state by every species, which means that its effluence is not usable to it. So it's just a matter of perspective whether energy is, stored energy is usable or not. But it's a real perspective because we can't eat the crap that we produce. Although, in some respects we are ending up doing that. But it's not good for us. It's exactly the same thing that happened with the original anaerobic bacteria that once populated this planet. According to Lynn Margulis's theory, the most stable period of life on planet Earth that lasted for the longest period of time was when it was just a single type of single-celled organism, anaerobic bacteria, which means they did not use oxygen, but they produced oxygen. That was their effluence, and it was toxic to them, just like all effluence is for all biological beings. And so that became the evolutionary driver. They became increasingly forced to be in contact with this stuff that was toxic to them, that they themselves produced. And it forced them to basically burrow into each other and develop the eukaryotic cell, where one of them became the mitochondria and the other one was sort of the host. And they developed this technique of ATP, using oxygen, which was previously toxic, as an energy source. So the thermodynamic thing of, energy from a usable to unusable state, it's like, well, usable to who is really the question. But when you stand back from it like that, it's just a natural process. Now, my hope is that at some point I can actually use the trigrams to describe that process explicitly. And I'm working on that, but I don't quite have it ready for you yet. So I guess you could say this is a prelude to my effort to be more specific about how the trigram might refer to changes in the physical domain. And with that, I will bring this particular broadcast to a close. I thank you for your attention. And those of you who have expressed your appreciation by tangibly supporting this channel, I'm very, very grateful for that. If you don't have the means to tangibly support, there are some links on the screen. Well, no, that's not what I meant to say. There are other ways that you can help out just simply by sharing this with like-minded people or with people who you think ought to be more like-minded or whatever it is. Send it on out there and let's see what sticks. That's pretty much what's going on here. We'll catch you next time. Adios.